A G7 commitment is that these are security assurances that are about countries being there with Ukraine and for Ukraine for years to come.
Canada is joining the G7 in providing long-term security guarantees to Ukraine. This announcement comes on the heels of the NATO Leaders Summit, which ended without a clear timeline for when Ukraine will be allowed into the military alliance. For more on this, I'm joined by Ukrainian Ambassador to Canada, Yulia Kovalev. Ambassador, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So NATO assured your country that Ukraine will be part of the alliance at a certain point in time, but no clarity on the date or timeline. Is that frustrating for you?
Actually, I think the summit, and I would quote here President Zelenskyy, the results of the summit are good, but of course they will be ideal if there will be a date of joining Ukraine as NATO. But of course, the key thing, what we realized that Ukraine, first of all, will be the NATO member. It was discussed with a lot of meetings, and I think that there is like less and less like minimum hesitation or almost no hesitation about it. But of course, the timing, first of all, is linked to the security situation in Ukraine and end of war and Ukraine's victory in this war. And of course, there is a way. And you mentioned that there is one also important outcome of the NATO summit in Vilnius is the declaration that was released today of all G7 countries about the security commitments and agreements with Ukraine. The declaration itself sets the floor of the further bilateral agreements between all G7 countries on how to prevent in the future any potential Russian aggression and what will be the role of each of the country by providing the military support, by increasing sanctions pressure, by supporting Ukraine with the training and the other areas for each country to step in. And of course, it's important that it's not only G7. We also call it as an open door policy for many other countries to join.
Anyone who wants to help, they can.
Yes, they can. And now the work will begin on the bilateral basis with all G7 countries. And of course, here, as we are discussing the results of the Vilnius summit, I would like to thank you, Canadian government and Canadian people, for the strong support and particularly for the strong understanding that Ukraine needs to be a NATO member. And as we are discussing the security guarantees, what is also important that is stated in this declaration, that this security guarantees is the interim mechanism before Ukraine joining NATO.
So there's a lot there to walk through, but just to go back to the whole idea of the timeline for NATO membership, we had Rose Gottemuller on the show yesterday, a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and she makes the salient point that until the fighting is over, letting Ukraine into NATO triggers Article 5, and we essentially go into a massive ground war. I mean, you accept that as a legitimate concern by the alliance, Ukraine does, despite President Zelenskyy's frustration calling it absurd at the beginning of the summit?
I think, you know, it is what President Zelenskyy said very clearly before the summit and in his interview during the Ukraine-NATO Council, that we realized that Ukraine it's hard for our partners to accept Ukraine when the war is going on. But we want also, and we will work further, and we hope the next Washington NATO summit, which will have the very remarkable anniversary of 75 years of the alliance itself, will then get more clear message about the timing when the war ends. And of course, there is a part of the homework that Ukraine will be doing with our partners in terms of the defense institutions, which is the part where we continue, despite the war, to build on the NATO standard institutions.
Right, and part of the announcement I saw today from the Prime Minister is some of your officers will be coming to Canada to be trained at the Royal Military College, part of continuing with Operation Unifier and the training of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. But the security guarantees is a tangible thing that came out of this. So how reassuring is that? Because there is, You know, in the United States in particular, there's a little bit of domestic divide, political divide on continuing support, and people do question the dollar value. But to have the Prime Minister of Japan go to a NATO meeting in the Baltics to offer this, I mean, what sort of a message does that send to the people of Ukraine?
It's an important message. First, it's an important message for the people of Ukraine that everybody was talking about Ukraine's NATO membership. The only concerns, it's about the timing of it. But on this way, we have significant progress, including the cancellation of the membership action plan, which was started in 2008 and never realized in anything material. Now we understand that this mechanism is out of the table. The second important thing is security guarantees, because the declaration which was published today clearly states that each G7 country, and with the open door policy, everybody else who would like to join, will negotiate with Ukraine on bilateral basis this kind of the agreement, which means it's not only, it's far and much far away from the concept of Budapest Memorandum, which ended up to be a piece of paper in reality. But that will be based on the mutual agreement,
right,
ratified with the parliaments of the countries as they're in the processes, and it will help to strengthen Ukraine defense sector.
One last point to touch on you with. Canada and a bunch of other countries have agreed to train and your pilots on how to fly the F-16 and then do maintenance and support on this. Something Ukraine has asked for a long time. This repeats this pattern of your government makes it very clear what you need. The West hesitates and then finally gives you what you want after great delay. So they're going to give you the F-16 training and the maintenance and support, but that means pilots maybe not until 2024. Does this slow start and ramp up an agreement, does that frustrate you at all? Because we saw this with air defense, we saw it with tanks, and now we're seeing it with jets.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Canada, because Canada joining each and every important coalition, whether it's supply of air defense, whether it's building Leopard tanks coalition, now it's the fighter jets coalition. We value Canada playing this important role together with the partners on joining the efforts.
Right.
Of course, there is not much, if we look in the history, this kind of the military operations which our soldiers are doing without actually covering from the air. And of course, it's hard. Russia still has much superiority in the air. We feel it in Ukrainian citizens, feel it, and unfortunately, many of them died because of the Russian missile attack. So fighter jets is desperately needed. We heard first some excuse that Ukrainian pilots cannot fly an F-16, there is no infrastructure. Everything now is, these arguments are day by day taking from the table because the training will start, the infrastructure will be there, and the fighter jets will be in Ukraine. And what is important to avoid these things? The main important thing, which also I do hope that this today's statement will be built up not only for the bilateral agreements for the security guarantees, but also it's important to have the program for a multi-year military support. And that we will greatly value from Canada and from our partners to make this commitment.